My name is Alara Vance. For the first 28 years of my life, I believed my purpose was to be the quiet counterpoint to my family's brilliance, the shadow that proved the sun was shining on everyone else. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, were architects of a life built on clean lines and public perception. My sister, Calla, was their masterpiece, vibrant, effortless, a socialite who could turn a room in her favor with a single, dazzling smile. I was their first draft, the one they tucked away in a drawer. I studied ecology, the quiet, intricate systems that hold the world together. I preferred the company of ancient trees and the silent language of mycelial networks to the clinking glasses and hollow laughter of my parents' world. It was a preference they never understood and, eventually, stopped trying to. The lawyer's office was a testament to their values. It smelled of expensive leather and ambition. Sunlight, filtered through vertical blinds, cut sharp, unforgiving stripes across the mahogany table. At the will reading, my parents smiled as the lawyer, a man with a name as polished as his shoes, handed Calla a thick portfolio. It represented the entirety of their investment accounts, valued at just over $5 million. Then, they turned to me, their expressions not cruel, but matter-of-fact, as if stating an inarguable truth. "Go earn your own," my father said, his voice calm, the words a clean, surgical cut. My mother added a gentle, almost pitying sigh. "We always knew you'd find your own way, dear. You were never one for the family business." I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just stared at the polished table, at the distorted reflection of my own face, pretending my pulse wasn't thudding in my ears like a trapped bird. The silence was absolute, a vacuum where a family used to be. Then something shifted. An older man in a simple gray suit, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. He was Mr. Alastair Finch, my grandfather's personal attorney, a man I hadn't seen in years. "There's one more document," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to absorb all the sharp edges in the room. He unfolded a worn, cream-colored envelope, the kind my grandfather used for his most important correspondence. It was sealed with wax and bore his familiar, sprawling handwriting. My mother's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. My father's fingers, which had been resting calmly on the table, twitched. Calla's eyes, bright with victory just moments before, narrowed into slits of wary suspicion. That envelope changed everything. It was the beginning of a storm, not of thunder and lightning, but of quiet, devastating truth, a storm that would tear through every carefully constructed lie they had ever built. And it started in a place I hadn't seen in over a year, my grandfather's coastal home on the outskirts of Port Blossom, Oregon, where the wind carrying the scent of salt and pine once sounded like safety and now carried the weight of secrets. I hadn't been back to the house since the spring before my grandfather, Arthur, passed away. It was strange how something so familiar could feel so foreign. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out of my car, a sound that used to signal my arrival for summers filled with tide pooling and stargazing. The hand-carved wooden wind chimes on the porch, once the gentle soundtrack to sun tea brewing on the windowsill, now sounded hollow, like echoes of something irrevocably lost. I hesitated before knocking. The deep blue paint on the door had peeled in the same places it always had, weathered by the salty air. The massive Douglas firs still leaned a little too far south, shaped by decades of coastal wind, but I didn't feel welcome. When the door creaked open, I half expected silence, the heavy quiet of an empty house. Instead, I got, "So, you finally decided to show up." My grandmother's voice hadn't changed. Maeve's words were still sharp enough to cut glass, but her face, framed by a wild halo of white hair, looked tired, etched with a grief deeper than I had ever seen. Her arms were crossed, her jaw set like stone. I stood frozen on the top step, trying to find something, anything in her face. Warmth, relief, even confusion. But there was only a chilling coldness. "Grandma," I started, my voice thinner than I intended. "What's going on?" I stepped closer, into the entryway that always smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. They told me you were too busy, that you didn't want to be bothered, that you had a new life." My own words sounded flimsy, a pathetic excuse even to my own ears. Her voice wavered, a tiny crack in the stone, then hardened again. Your grandfather called for you, Alara. Every single day on his deathbed. He asked for you. I swallowed against a sudden tightness in my throat. That's not true. I tried to call. I came by in March for his birthday. Kala was here. She said no one was home. Maeve's eyes, the same deep ocean blue as the front door, narrowed. We were here. We were always here. There was a long, painful pause that stretched between us, thick with years of unspoken words. Then she turned and disappeared into the house without a word. I followed her in, the air inside feeling heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The living room was just as I remembered it, the worn floral armchair by the stone fireplace, the shelves overflowing with books on botany and astronomy, the faint scent of wood smoke. She returned from the small study, holding a worn leather notepad, the kind Arthur always kept by the phone. This is the number he kept calling, she said, handing it to me. I recognized his handwriting instantly, blocky and neat, with just a hint of a forward slant. But the number on the page, written and rewritten a dozen times, was not mine. Grandma, this isn't my number. It's not even close. I've had the same one since college. She stared at the notepad, her brows knitting together in a slow, painful realization. They told us you changed it. That you didn't want to be tracked down. That you were ashamed of us. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I backed toward the wall, needing its solid support. They lied to you. They cut me off from you on purpose. Her hands, usually so steady from decades of gardening, trembled. She sank slowly into the worn floral armchair beside the fireplace, as if her knees had given up. They told me the funeral was at noon, I whispered, the memory of fresh, sharp pain. I got to the church, and it was empty. The doors were locked. She looked up, her face pale, all the sharp anger drained away, leaving only a vast, hollow sorrow. The funeral was at 9 a.m, she said softly. They told everyone you didn't show up. That you didn't care enough to come. My breath caught in my chest. I would never have missed his funeral. Never. For a moment, the room was quiet. Too quiet. And then I felt it, like a crack in a dam I'd been holding back for years. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and a single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. I sank to the floor beside her chair, clutching her hand like a child lost in a storm. I didn't know, I sobbed, the words muffled and broken. I didn't know he was even sick until it was too late. Her voice softened, losing its brittle edge, and her hand, thin and cool, brushed mine. We know the truth now, Alara. That's what matters. We know. We sat there for a long time. The silence was no longer awkward or cold. It was heavy, thick with everything that had been unsaid between us, a shared grief that was finally allowed to breathe. The old grandfather clock in the hall ticked louder than I remembered, each tick a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the quiet house. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing dry leaves across the porch like restless memories. Finally, Maeve stood up. Her hands shook slightly, but there was a fire behind her eyes, a resolve I hadn't seen in years. I'm calling them, she said. Calling who? She didn't answer at first. She went to the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall, the one Arthur had refused to replace, and began dialing. Each click of the dial felt deliberate, loaded, like punctuation to a sentence she had waited too long to write. I watched her fingers, thinned by age but steady with purpose. When the line connected, her voice was clipped and cold as a winter morning. Eleanor, I need you, Richard, and Kala. Here. Now. A muffled protest came through the receiver, but she cut it off. No, it can't wait. Be here in an hour. She hung up without saying goodbye. Then she turned to me. Mr. Finch is on his way, too. I blinked. Arthur's lawyer. She nodded. Your grandfather. He left some things, instructions. But he made it very clear they were to be read only with everyone present. So, that's exactly what we're going to do. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just nodded, a strange calm settling over me. For the next hour, I sat at the small kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wood with my finger. This was the table where Arthur used to sip his morning coffee while reading the scientific journals I mailed him from college. The place where he'd first asked about my undergraduate thesis on lichen symbiosis. The place where I once told him I wanted to study how forests communicate, and he hadn't laughed. He had leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest, and said, "Tell me more." I looked around the kitchen. The same faded floral curtains, the same low hum of the old refrigerator. But the air had changed. It was charged, expectant. Footsteps echoed on the porch. The doorbell rang, a sharp, impatient chime. Maeve placed a hand on my shoulder, a brief, firm pressure. "Stay here. I'll call you when it's time." From the kitchen, I could hear them arrive one by one. My mother's overly sweet, melodic voice. "Oh, Maeve, my goodness. It smells exactly the same in here." "So rustic." My father's calm, measured tone, designed to control any situation. "I thought this was all handled already." Calla's dismissive sigh. "Seriously, this couldn't have waited until after the estate finishes processing?" Then silence. And Maeve's voice, colder than I had ever heard it. "Please sit down. Mr. Alistair Finch is on his way. He will be reading Arthur's final instructions." I could imagine their faces, confused, curious, a little annoyed. They didn't know I was here. They didn't know what was about to unfold. And, in truth, neither did I. But deep down, in the quiet place I had learned to retreat to, I hoped that maybe, just once, someone would say out loud what I had always known in my bones, that what they did wasn't love. That silence and exclusion and manipulation weren't misunderstandings. They were choices. The front door creaked again. I heard a new voice, steady and professional. "Mr. Finch." "This won't take long," he said. "But it must be done properly, as per Mr. Vance's wishes." That was my cue. Maeve's voice called out, clear and strong. "Alara. Come in now." I stood up. My heart raced, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce anticipation. And as I stepped through the kitchen doorway into the living room, 3 heads turned in my direction, their eyes widening, their carefully composed expressions unraveling all at once. My mother's smile froze on her face. My father's jaw tightened. Calla's face went pale. The air in the room snapped, thick with static. They weren't just surprised to see me. They were terrified. All 3 of them just stared. My mother blinked rapidly, as if she were trying to clear an apparition from her vision. My father adjusted his collar, a nervous tic I hadn't seen in years, one he only did when he felt he'd lost control of a room. Calla's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked like someone had yanked the script from her hands mid-performance. I kept my back straight, my chin level. If they expected me to cower or apologize for my own existence, they would be disappointed. Maeve gestured to an empty armchair across from them, next to the fireplace. I sat down slowly, my movements deliberate, and met their gazes one by one. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, gave me a quick, polite nod, his expression unreadable. He opened his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with the same wax as the letter he'd shown me earlier. "This," he began, his voice commanding the room's attention, "is the final codicil and personal addendum to the last will and testament of Arthur M. Vance, recorded and sealed per his explicit request. In addition to the official documents, he has included a handwritten letter to be read aloud." No one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire Maeve had lit in the hearth. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To my wife, Maeve Vance." Maeve didn't even blink, her eyes fixed on my parents. "I leave our family home, the surrounding 10 acres, and sufficient funds for her comfort and continued care. She knows how to find the rest." He turned a page. "To my granddaughter, Alara Vance." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing tight. I could feel their collective stare on me, heavy and unnerving. "I leave the Oakhaven Ecological Study, located at 144 Hemlock Ridge Road, Port Blossom, including the land, all laboratory equipment, active research patents, intellectual property, and the attached endowment fund currently filed under the Vance Foundation." A sharp, indrawn breath. It wasn't mine. It was Calla's. My mother's eyes darted between her and my father, a frantic, silent conversation passing between them. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my posture unchanged. Mr. Finch continued, his tone even. And finally, the remainder of my estate, including all personal financial holdings, stocks, and retirement funds, shall be divided equally between my two granddaughters, Elara and Calla Vance. There it was. A quiet, elegant bomb. But the explosion came right after. Calla shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a raw screech. "What?" she spat, her voice cracking with disbelief. "He gave her Oakhaven? The entire facility? That's insane." You told me," she pointed a trembling finger at our parents. "You said it would all be mine. That if I just kept visiting him, if I smiled and played nice and brought him his favorite scotch, that everything would come to me." My father's lips tightened into a thin, white line, but he didn't respond. My mother stared at the floor, as if the intricate pattern of the Persian rug might open up and swallow her whole. I just sat there, still, watching it all unravel. Mr. Finch raised one hand calmly. "There is more. Mr. Vance also wrote a personal letter to Elara, which he requested be read aloud in this room, in front of the family." Calla let out a bitter, humorless laugh, but no one joined her. Maeve retrieved a folded letter from the drawer of a small side table and handed it to the lawyer. "He wrote this the week before he died," she said, her voice steady. "He made me promise." The lawyer unfolded it slowly, careful with the creased, precious paper. Arthur's handwriting, broad, confident, full of character, filled the page. "To my dearest Elara," Mr. Finch began reading. "If this is being read, then I am no longer by your side. But my belief in you remains stronger than ever." The words hit me like a warm wind through an open window, a gentle force that steadied my shaking insides. You were always the quiet one, the observer, the thinker. The one who asked why, when others didn't care to. Calla slumped back into her chair, defeated. My mother's fingers twisted in her lap. My father turned his head to look out the window, at the gray Oregon sky. "You built your own truth in a family that never learned to honor yours." I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not revenge, but a profound, aching sense of recognition. "You were never a mistake, my girl. You were the legacy I was proudest of." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't look away from my family. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to hear every single word. Mr. Finch's voice remained steady, even as the weight of the words changed the very air in the room. "I saw how you clutched that little spiral notebook when you were 7, tracking the patterns of migrating birds. I saw how your face lit up when you discovered the symbiotic relationship between fungi and tree roots, while everyone else only saw dirt and distractions." My chest tightened. I remembered that notebook. I still had it, tucked away in a box of things that mattered only to me. He continued, "I saw the way your joy dimmed when your mother brushed you off. The way your father changed the subject every time you shared something you were proud of." I heard my mother inhale sharply, a sound of protest cut short. I didn't look at her. Calla was easier for them, the letter went on. She sparkled in all the ways they understood. But you, Elara, you glowed in ways they couldn't translate. And instead of learning your language, they tried to shut you out. Calla shifted in her seat, her arms folded tightly across her chest. I don't blame her entirely. She played the part they handed her. But you wrote your own role. And that, my girl, takes a courage they will never comprehend. A single tear rolled down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I remember the day you won the state science fair, and you asked me to hide the trophy in my workshop. You said, maybe if I don't show it to them, they'll stop looking at me like I'm someone else's child. A low, painful sound, an exhale of breath, escaped from somewhere across the room. It might have been my father. You deserve celebration, Elara. Not invisibility. And while I cannot undo the damage they have done, I can give you something that is entirely yours. A place to build freely, without apology, without their shadows. Mr. Finch paused, folding the letter slowly and placing it on the table. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with memory, with resentment, and with something new and sharp, clarity. I cleared my throat, my voice surprisingly steady. I remember that science fair, I said softly, breaking the tension. Mom didn't come. She was at Kalla's dance recital dress rehearsal. Kalla flinched. I came home afterward, I continued, looking at my father, holding that trophy like it was some kind of sin. My father finally spoke, turning from the window. Alara, this isn't the time to rehash the past. No, I said, my voice sharpening, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. It's the only time. Because all I ever got from either of you was, why can't you just be more like your sister? I turned to Kalla. And from you? Every time I tried to be proud of something, you turned it into a threat to your spotlight. She scoffed, a flash of her old self returning. Oh, come on. You always made yourself the victim. I worked for what I got. I nodded slowly. You mean you visited Grandpa when it was convenient for your schedule? You smiled when you were told to. You said all the right things because you thought it would pay off. Her expression hardened. And what? You think you're so pure? You disappeared for years. No, I snapped, the word cutting through the air. I was cut off. You told Grandma I didn't want to see her. You gave Grandpa a fake phone number and made sure I never got his messages. That isn't distance. That is erasure. My mother stood up abruptly. Enough. Alara, you're twisting everything. This family has been through a lot. This family, Maeve cut in, her voice like steel, has been living a lie. And I let it happen for far too long. My mother turned to her, stunned. Mother, don't. I watched you, Maeve said, her gaze sweeping over all three of them, turn a blind eye to Alara's pain. I believed you when you said she didn't care about us. I should have known better. Arthur knew better. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Look, Alara got her education, her lab camps, her travel. That wasn't free. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It wasn't. But you didn't pay for any of it. Grandpa did. Every single cent. The scholarships he found for me, the flights to research conferences, the journal subscriptions. You didn't even know where I went half the time. My voice cracked, just once. You made me feel like a burden. He made me feel seen. Kalla stood up, her face a mask of fury. This is ridiculous. I was told I'd get everything. I was the one who stayed. I was the good daughter. No, I said calmly, looking her straight in the eye. You were the performer. The chosen one. I was the hidden one. But Grandpa didn't forget me. And now, you don't get to erase me anymore. Her face twisted with a final, bitter snarl. Why should you get anything? Just because you're some sad little genius with a field journal. I allowed myself a small, sad smile. No. I get something because I earned his love honestly. And that's the one thing you never understood. Love isn't a performance. It's not a transaction. Then Maeve stood. She walked to the center of the room, her small frame radiating an unshakable strength. I regret that Arthur left you anything at all, she said, looking directly at Kalla. You may have played the role, but it was never love. It was a transaction, and I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner. She then turned her gaze on my parents. Leave. You are not welcome in this house. My mother gasped. Maeve, you can't mean that. Out, Maeve said again, her voice low and final. Now. They didn't move at first, frozen in disbelief. Then Kalla, with a choked sound of fury, grabbed her designer handbag and stormed out, her heels hitting the old wood floors like gunshots. My parents followed, stunned and muttering about legal challenges and disrespect. For the first time in my life, they left a room without taking anything with them. The door clicked shut behind them. No slamming, just a quiet, profound finality. I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, unsure what to feel. The room was quiet now, not tense, not explosive, just free. Maeve walked past me and sat down slowly on the sofa. Her hands, which had trembled with anger moments earlier, now rested calmly in her lap. They'll come back, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They always do. Maybe, she replied, looking at me with a soft, weary wisdom. But this time, we don't have to let them in. It took a long while for that to sink in. For so long, I had operated on a silent, one-sided contract. If I proved myself enough, if I achieved enough, if I stayed useful and quiet, maybe one day they would see me. Maybe they would finally call me daughter, sister, family, without flinching. But standing in that room, with the echo of my grandfather's words still hanging in the air like the scent of pine, I realized something painfully simple. I had been trying to earn love from people who never had any to give. And Arthur? He had seen that long before I did. I think I need some air, I said. Maeve nodded, and I stepped out onto the back porch. The old boards creaked under my feet, a sound that once meant home and now meant change. The wild roses Arthur had planted were still blooming, their scent mingling with the salty air. Beyond the fence was the same patch of coastal forest where he had first taught me to identify nurse logs and bracket fungi. He'd called it the forest's nursery. I thought of that girl, 10 years old with her knees perpetually stained with dirt and her eyes bright with discovery, and I wondered how long she had been buried under expectations that were never her own. When I came back inside, Maeve had placed a kettle on the stove. She moved slowly, her actions deliberate. You know, she said, her back to me as she measured out tea leaves, Arthur started planning Oakhaven 5 years ago. Long before he even got sick. I looked at her, startled. He told me he wanted you to have a space that didn't require permission to be yourself. I felt the tears before they came. This time they were quiet, clean, with no shaking or sobbing. Just release. That night, I stayed in my old room for the first time in years. The wallpaper with its faint pattern of sailboats was faded, the mattress a little too soft, but the ceiling still had those glow-in-the-dark stars Arthur had helped me stick up when I was 9. I'd made him arrange them in scientifically accurate constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. He hadn't even questioned it. As I lay there, staring up at the faint green glow, I realized something else. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt reclaimed. The next morning, I brewed coffee for both of us and brought it to the kitchen table, the same one I used to avoid when my parents visited because it felt too small for their presence. Maeve folded the local newspaper and gave me a tired but warm smile. So, she asked, her voice gentle. What now? I think I'll go see it, I said. The study. Oakhaven. She nodded, her eyes bright. He'd like that. I looked out the window. The morning sunlight broke gently across the swaying branches of the firs. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to run, or prove, or explain. I didn't feel invisible. And that, more than money, more than any inheritance, was the first real gift I had ever received from this family. The one person who believed in me had left behind something greater than a legacy. He had left me permission to begin again. The first time I saw the Oakhaven Ecological Study, it didn't look like a state-of-the-art laboratory. It looked like a beautifully converted barn, and that's exactly what it was. Nestled at the far end of a dusty gravel road off Hemlock Ridge, the building had wide, weathered cedar beams, a moss-dusted roof, and a pair of enormous double doors that looked like they belonged on a horse stable, not a research facility. But inside was magic. The space had been completely renovated. Glass panels lined the entire east-facing wall, allowing the full morning light to pour in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Long, custom-built work tables were neatly arranged with untouched lab equipment, microscopes, centrifuges, high-resolution data tablets, and even a 3D printer still wrapped in its protective plastic. Shelves that reached to the vaulted ceiling held unopened boxes meticulously labeled with my name. In the very center of the room stood a single, heavy workbench made of reclaimed redwood. On top of it, placed as if it were a sacred text, was my childhood notebook. The spiral-bound one with the tattered cover, the one I thought I'd lost during a college move, the one filled with my messy, 7-year-old handwriting and tiny, earnest diagrams of bird migration patterns. My knees almost gave out. Arthur hadn't just built me a lab. He had built me a sanctuary for my mind. Over the next few weeks, I moved into the small cottage attached to the annex and made Oakhaven my entire world. I recruited 2 graduate students, Tara and Micah, friends from my university program who shared the same stubborn hope that science could still be profoundly human. We started small, with a local grant to study the impact of logging on native pollinator populations. Then we partnered with a regional farming co-op to test sustainable crop rotations that could restore soil health. We made mistakes. We burned out a costly piece of equipment, cried over rejected grant proposals, and spent sleepless nights wrestling with broken data models. And yet, we kept showing up. Every morning, I unlocked the doors to a place that didn't ask me to explain myself. A place where my intense focus wasn't seen as odd, where my quiet nature wasn't a social failing. A place where being too curious or too smart was not something to apologize for. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal funding rejection from a national foundation, I found myself alone in the annex. Tara and Micah had gone home, defeated for the day. The lights were dimmed, and I sat on the cool concrete floor by the storage closet, surrounded by rejected printouts and empty coffee cups, feeling the old, familiar sting of not being good enough. I reached into my bag and pulled out Arthur's letter, the one Mr. Finch had let me keep. I unfolded the worn paper, my fingers tracing the familiar lines, and found the sentence I'd read 100 times already. I whispered it into the quiet, cavernous space. You wrote your own role. It wasn't just encouragement. It was an instruction. That night, I didn't go to bed. I wrote a new proposal, not for another academic study, but for something different. A youth science program based in the rural schools of our county. A program for the kids like I used to be, quiet, curious, easily overlooked. We called it the Little Scientist Initiative. Our first year, we worked with just 12 students. They came from small coastal towns where school science labs were often just a dusty closet of outdated textbooks. We gave each child a leather-bound notebook, a replica of mine, with Arthur's words stamped in gold foil on the first page. Write the things they don't understand. One day, the world will. That fall, a shy girl named Amber, barely 13, with hair that always fell in her face, showed me pages and pages of meticulous behavior observations she'd done in her own backyard. Her calculations were clumsy, her grammar was wild, but her mind was brilliant. When I told her that, she stared at me as if I'd just handed her a planet. You actually read it? She whispered. I smiled, my heart aching with a kind of retroactive joy. Of course I did. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It was about planting something new in better soil and giving it the sun and space to grow without fear. The email came 3 years after the will reading. It was from a lawyer I didn't recognize, someone representing Calavance. The subject line was short and clinical: request for visit, Oakhaven Ecological Study. At first, I braced for legal trouble. I assumed it was another attempt to challenge the will, to reopen some forgotten clause, or to stir up a version of the past we had already buried. But when Calla arrived, I barely recognized her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair. She wore a simple navy coat that seemed too big for her shoulders and no makeup. She walked into the main lobby of the annex slowly, hesitantly, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. I stood beside a large, framed portrait of Arthur that hung above the reception desk. She paused when she saw it, her gaze lingering on his kind, weathered face. He always knew who you were, she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharp confidence. Even when I didn't. Especially when I didn't. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. So I just nodded. I'd like to see it, she said, her eyes finally meeting mine. The lab. The work. What you've done with it. I could have said no. Part of me, the wounded part, wanted to. But I didn't. I gave her the tour. She walked beside me through the greenhouse complexes, where we were cultivating native plants for habitat restoration. We passed the student display wall, filled with photos from our Little Scientist Initiative, Amber proudly holding her first-place ribbon, a group of kids examining lichen through magnifying glasses. She didn't talk much, just asked simple, honest questions. How do you fund all this? What's this device for? Do the kids get to publish their results? When we reached the community garden, a vibrant space where local families were growing their own food using our sustainable methods, she stopped walking. There were children harvesting lettuce, a mother and son laughing near the compost bins, a father testing soil moisture with one of our field kits. The air was filled with the sounds of life and collaboration. Calla turned to me, her voice breaking on the last word. I don't expect you to forgive me. I stayed quiet, letting the silence hang between us, thick but not uncomfortable. I just wanted to see what he built for you, she said, her gaze sweeping over the garden. And what you built with it. She didn't cry, but her hands wouldn't stop moving, tugging at the sleeves of her coat, tracing invisible circles on the wooden railing. I let her stay as long as she wanted. There were no lectures from me, no retaliation, just the quiet, unassailable truth of the place itself. We don't talk often, but twice a year now, Kala drives up from the city and volunteers for our youth science summer camp. She helps the kids with their presentation skills, teaching them how to explain complicated data in plain English, how to stand with confidence when they speak. The kids, especially the shy ones, love her. Some of them even call her Coach Kala. At the end of her first summer volunteering, she handed me a slim folder. I wrote a communication guide for the shy kids, she said, looking almost embarrassed. I thought it might help. I opened it later that night. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful, gentle, and real. For the first time in my life, I saw a version of my sister that wasn't a performance. She has never apologized with words, not directly. But she shows up. And that, I've learned, is more than I ever expected. And maybe, just maybe, it's enough. We aren't sisters the way other people mean it, with a shared history of comfort and secrets. But here, in this tiny corner of a world Arthur dreamed up for me, we have stopped pretending. And somehow, that feels like the beginning of something true. It's been 6 years since the will reading. 6 years since the front door of my grandparents' house clicked shut behind my parents and Kala, their footsteps echoing down the porch like the end of a performance for which no one applauded. I haven't spoken to my parents since. Sometimes their names appear in the society pages of magazines I don't read, or in press releases for charities they support in Florida, where they retired early. I don't hate them, but I don't miss them either. What I feel is a quiet, settled distance, like looking at a coastline from a ship that has already set sail. What I do think about is the work. The Oakhaven Ecological Study has grown into something beyond my wildest imagination. What started as one converted barn is now a full research campus, 4 labs, 3 greenhouses, and over 60 acres of trial fields. We've developed drought-resistant seed varieties that are now being used by farmers in parts of the country where traditional crops fail. We've partnered with universities from Kenya to Brazil to share our findings in regenerative agriculture. And just last month, I stood on a stage in San Francisco, accepting a national grant for climate innovation. The lights were bright, but I didn't flinch. I wore a simple navy suit and Arthur's old pocket watch, the one Maeve gave me last year, tucked inside the breast pocket. Inside the lid is a tiny, faded photo of me at age 10, standing proudly next to my bird migration display, grinning from ear to ear. He carried it with him every day, Maeve had said. Now it sits on my desk at the annex, right where the morning light hits it and casts small, bright circles over my research notes. Some days, I talk to him. Not with words, but in the quiet moments, when an experiment finally succeeds, when a kid from our program wins a scholarship, when I remember how close I came to believing I didn't matter. He never let me disappear. Not really. And now, I finally understand why. A legacy isn't a monument built of stone and wealth. It's a map, one built from choices and kindness and tiny, loving anchors left behind for someone to follow when the world tries to erase them. These days, Maeve lives in a small, sunny apartment connected to my house in town. She's slower now, more forgetful, but her mind is still sharper than anyone I know when it counts. We drink tea every morning in the sunroom. She tells me stories about Arthur I've never heard, how he once planted an entire row of sunflowers just to win a bet with her, how he believed that soil could remember kindness, how he always knew, somehow, that I would find my way back. Some evenings, I walk to the far end of the Oakhaven fields, past the solar irrigation test beds and the kids' garden plots, to the old wooden bench Arthur built by hand at the edge of the forest. From there, I can see the stars. Real ones, not the glow-in-the-dark kind I stuck on my bedroom ceiling as a child. But they still make me think of that girl I once was. The one who kept asking why, even when no one cared to answer. The one who refused to be quieted. the one he believed in. And on nights like these, when the wind moves just right through the tall pines, I swear I can hear his voice in the rustling leaves, a gentle and persistent whisper. Write the things they don't understand. One day, the world will. And now, finally, it does.